everyone, I'll be reading you Alex Rider, the start of Alex Rider, Book 8. Book 8, Crocodile Tears. Chapter 1, Firestar. Ravi Chandra was going to be a rich man. It made his head spin to think about it. The next few hours, he'd earn more than he had managed in the last 20 years. A fantastic sum paid in cash right into his hands. It was the start of a new life. He would be able to buy his wife the clothes she wanted. A car, a proper diamond ring to replace the flimsy band of gold she had worn since they were married. He would take his two young boys to Disneyland in Florida, and he would travel to London and see the Indian cricket team play at Lord's. Something he had dreamt about all his life, but had never thought possible until now. He sat hunched up beside the window of the bus that was taking him to work, as he had done every day for as long as he could remember. It was devilishly hot. The fans had broken down once again, and of course the company was in no hurry to replace them. Worse still, this was the end of June, the time of year in South India as Agni Nakshatram or Firestar. The sun was unforgiving. It was almost impossible to breathe. The damp heat clung to you from morning till night, and the whole city stank. When he had money, he would move. He would leave the cramped two-roomed flat in Peramba, the busiest, most crowded part of the city, and go and live somewhere quieter and cooler, with a little more space to stretch out. He would have a fridge full of beer and a big plasma TV. Really, it wasn't too much to ask. The bus was so slow. The bus was slowing down. Ravi had done this journey so many times that he would have known where they were with his eyes closed. They had left the city behind them. In the distance, there was hills, steep and covered, every inch of them, with thick green vegetation. But the area he was in now was more like a wasteland, with just a few palm trees sprouting among the rubble, and electricity pylons closing in on all sides. His place of work was just ahead. In a moment they would stop at the first security gate. Ravi was an engineer. His identity badge with his photograph and full name, Ravindra Manpreet Chandra, described him as a plant operator. He worked at the Jawada nuclear power station just 3 miles north of Chennai, the 4th largest city in India, formerly known as Madras. He glanced up, and there was the power station in front of him, a series of huge multicolored blocks securely locked inside miles and miles of wire. It sometimes occurred to him that wire defined Jawada. There was a razor wire and barbed wire fences and telephone lines, and the electricity that they manufactured was carried all over India by thousands more miles of wire. How strange to think that someone turned on the TV in Pondicherry or their bedside light in Nellore. It had all begun here. The bus stopped at the security point with its CCTV cameras and armed guards following the 9/11 attacks on New York and Washington. Nuclear power plants all over the world had become reorganized as potentially terrorist targets. New batteries had been added. Security forces had been enlarged. For a long time, it had all been a damned nuisance when people were ready to jump on you if you were so much as sneezed. But people had got lazy. Take old Suresh, for example. The guard at this outer checkpoint, he recognized everyone on the bus. He saw them at the same time every day. In at 7:30, out at 5:30. Occasionally he'd bump into them patrolling past the shops on Ranganatha Street. He wouldn't even knew the wives and girlfriends. It wouldn't have occurred to him to ask for ID or to check what they were carrying into Jawada. He waved the bus through. 2 minutes later, Ravi got out. He was a short, skinny man with bad skin and a moustache that sat uncomfortably on his upper lip. He was already wearing overalls and protective steel-capped shoes. He was carrying a heavy toolbox. Nobody asked him that he'd had to fix something in the flat where he'd lived. Maybe he'd been moonlighting, doing some jobs for the neighbours for extra rupees. Ravi was always carrying a toolkit. It was as much a part of him as an arm or leg. The bus had come to a final halt beside a brick wall with a door winch, which, like every door at Jawada, was made out of solid steel, designed to hold back smoke, fire, or even direct missile strike. Another guard and more television cameras watched as the passengers got out and went through. On the other side of the door, a blank whitewashed corridor led to the side of the door. A blank whitewashed corridor led to a locker room. One of the few places in the complex that wasn't air conditioned. Ravi opened his locker. There was a pin-up of the Bollywood star Shilpa Shetty stuck inside the door and took out a safety helmet, goggles, earplugs, and a fluorescent jacket. He removed a bunch of keys like most nuclear power stations. There were very few swipe cards or electronic locks on the door at Jawada. This was another safety measure. Manual locks and keys would still operate in the event of a power failure. Still clutching his toolbox, Ravi set off down another corridor. When he had first come to work, he had been amazed how clean everything was, especially when he compared it with the street where he had lived, which was full of rubbish, and potholes with muddy water, and droppings from the oxygen which lumbered along pulling wooden carts between the cars and the motorized rickshaws. He turned to a corner and there was the next checkpoint, the final barrier he would have to pass through before he was actually in. For the first time he was nervous. He knew what he was carrying and remembered what he was about to do. What would happen if he was stopped? He would go to jail, perhaps for the rest of his life. He had heard stories about Chennai Central Prison, about images buried in tiny cells far underground, and food so disgusting that some preferred to starve to death. But it was too late to back out now. If he hesitated or did anything suspicious, there was one sure way to get stopped. He came to a massive turnstile with bars as thick as baseball bats. It only allowed one person in at a time, and then you'd have to shuffle through as if you were being processed like some sort of factory machine. There was also an X-ray scanner, a metal detector, and yet more guards. Hey, Ravi! Ramesh, my friend, you see the cricket last night? I saw it. What a match! 2 wickets down and we still came back. I thought we were finished. Cricket, football, tennis, whatever sport was their currency. Every day the plant operators passed it between them, and Ravi had deliberately watched the match the night before, so that he could join in the conversation. Even in the cool of the corridor, he was sweating. He could feel the perspiration beading on his forehead, and he wiped it away with the back of his hand. Surely someone would stop and ask him why he was still holding onto his toolbox. Everyone knew the correct procedure. It should be opened and searched, all the contents taken out, but it didn't happen. A moment later he was through. had so much as questioned him. It had just gone as he'd hoped it would. Nobody had lifted off the top tray of the little book and discovered 10 kilos of C4 plastic explosive concealed underneath. Riley walked away from the barrier and stopped in front of a row of shelves. He pulled out a small plastic device that looked like a pager. This was his EPD, or electronic personal dosimeter, which recorded his own radiation level and warned him if he came into contact with any radioactive material. It was set with his personal ID and security clearance. There were 4 levels of security at Jawada, each one allowing access to areas with different risks of contamination. Just for once, Ravi's EPD had been sent to the highest level. Today he was going to enter the heart of the power station, the reactor chamber itself. This was where the deadly flame of Jawada burned. 60,000 uranium fuel rods, each one 3.85 meters long, bound together inside the pressure vessel. That was the reactor itself. Every minute of the day and night, 20,000 tons of fresh water was sent rushing through pipes. The resulting steam, 2 tons of it every second, powered the turbines. Turbines produced electricity. That was how it worked. In many ways, it was very simple. A nuclear reactor is at once the safest and the most dangerous place on the planet. An accident might have such nightmarish consequences that there can be no accident. The reactor chamber at Jawada was made out of steel reinforced concrete. The walls were 1.5 meters thick. The great dome stretching out over the whole expanse was the height and breadth of a major cathedral. In the event of a malfunction, the reactor could be turned off in seconds, and whatever happened in this chamber would be contained. Nothing could be allowed to leak through to the outside world. 1,000 safeguards had been built into the construction and the running of Jawada. One man with a dream of watching cricket in London was about to blow them apart. The approach had come 6 weeks before at the street corner closest to his flat. 2 men, one a European, the other from Delhi. It turned out that the second man was a friend of Ravi's cousin, Jagdish, who worked in a kitchen of a 5-star hotel. Once they had recognized each other, it seemed almost natural to go for tea and samosas, particularly as the European were playing. How much do they pay you at Jawada? Only 15,000 rupees a month? A child couldn't live on that amount. And you have a wife and family. These people, the cheat, the honest worker, maybe it's time they were taught a lesson. Very quickly, the conversation was steered the way the 2 men wanted it to go, and the first time they left him with a gift, a fake Rolex watch. And why not? Jagdish had done them favours in the past, giving them free food, which he stole from the kitchen. Now it was their turn to look after Ravi. The next time they met a week later. It was an iPhone, the real thing. But the gifts were only a glimpse of the riches that could be his if he would just agree to undertake a piece of business on their behalf. It was dangerous. A few people might be hurt, but you, my friend, it will mean a new life. It will mean a new life. Everything you ever wanted can be yours. Ravi Chandra entered the reactor chamber at the Jawada nuclear power station at exactly 8 o'clock. Five other engineers went in with him. They had to go in one at a time through an airlock, a white circular corridor with an automatic sliding door at each end. In many ways, it looked like something out of a spaceship, and its purpose was much the same. The exit wouldn't open until the entrance had closed. It was all part of the need for total containment. The 5 men were dressed identically with safety helmets and goggles. All of them were carrying toolboxes. For the rest of the day. They would carry out a series of tasks, some of them as ordinary as oiling or valve or changing light bulbs. Even the most advanced technology needs occasionally maintenance. As they emerged from the airlock into the reactor chamber, they seemed almost to vanish. So tiny they were in these vast surroundings, dwarfed by bright yellow gantries and walkways overhead, by electrical hoists and cables, soaring banks of machinery, fuel rod transportation canisters, and generations. Arc lamps shone down from the edges of the dome, and in the middle of it all, surrounded by ladders and platforms, would look like an empty swimming pool plunged 12 meters down, with stainless steel pads on all 4 sides. This was the reactor. Underneath a 150-ton steel cap, millions of uranium atoms were splitting again and again, producing unimaginable heat. 4 metal towers stood guarding the chamber. If they were shaped a little like rockets, they were rockets that would never fly. Each one was locked in its own steel cage and connected to the rest of the machinery by a network of massive pipes. These were reactor coolant pumps, keeping the water rushing around on its vital journey. Inside each metal casing, a 50-ton motor was spinning at the rate of 1,500 revs per minute. The pumps were labelled north, south, east, and west. The south pump was going to be Ravi's primary target. But first of all he crossed to the other side of the reactor chamber to a door marked emergency, exit only. The 2 men had explained everything very carefully to him. There was no point of attacking the reactor cap. Nothing could penetrate it, nor was there any point in sabotaging the reactor chamber. Not while it was locked down. Any blast and any radiation leak would be contained. To achieve their aims, an exit had to be found. The power of nuclear reactor had to be set free. And then it was on the blueprint they had shown him. The emergency airlocks were at the Achilles heel in the fortification of Jawada. It should never have been built. There was no need, and it had never been used. The reason for a passageway between the reactor chamber and the back of the turbine hall were it opened onto a patch of wasteland close to the perimeter fence, was to reassure the workers that they were a fast way out. That there was a fast way out if it should ever be needed. But what it also provided was a single pathway from the reactor to the outside world. In one sense, it was the barrel of a gun. All it needed to be was unblocked. Nobody noticed Ravi as he strolled over to the emergency door, and even if they had, they wouldn't have remarked on it. Everyone had their own worksheet. They would assume he was just following his. He opened the inner door, a solid metal plate, and let himself into the corridor. About halfway along, there was a control panel fixed high up in the wall. Standing on tiptoe, Ravi unscrewed it, using one of the few real tools he had brought with him. Inside there was a complicated mass of circuitry, but he knew exactly what to do. He cut 2 separate wires and spliced them together. It was quite easy, really. The exit door slid open in front of him, revealing a patch of blue sky beyond the wire fence. He felt the sluggish air roll in. Somewhere, perhaps in the control room, someone would notice what had happened. Even now, a light might be blinking on one of the controllers, but it'd be a while before anyone came to investigate. By then it would be too late. Roy went back into the reactor chamber and overturned every of the 4 reactor coolant pumps. This was the only way that wide-scale sabotage was possible. Why was he aiming for what was known in the nuclear industry as a LOCA, a loss of coolant accident? It was a LOCA that had caused the catastrophe at Chernobyl, and it was the same at a 3-mile island in Pennsylvania, America. The pump was locked in its cage, but Ravi had the key. That was one of the reasons he had chosen for this job. The right man in the right place. He stopped in front of the cylindrical wall that rose more than 20 meters into the air. He could hear the machinery inside. The noise was constant and deafening. His mouth was dry now as he thought about what he was going to do. Was he mad? Suppose they traced this back to him. But at the same time there was Cricket, Ajala, his wife Disneyland, a new life. His family were not in Chennai today. He had sent them to friends in Bangalore. They'll be safe. He was doing this for them. He had to do this for them. For a few brief seconds, greed and few hung in balance, but then the scale tipped. He knelt down and placed the toolbox against the metal casing, opened it and removed the top shelf. The inside was almost filled with the bulk of plastic explosives, but there was just one room for the timer. A digital display showing 10 minutes, the tangles of wires and a switch. 10 minutes, that would be more than enough time to leave the chamber before the bomb went off. He would exit the same way he had come in. And once he was safe, he was on the other side of the airlock, he would be safe. If anyone questioned him, he would say he needed a toilet. After a blast, the panic alarms, a well-rehearsed evacuation, radiation suits for everyone. He would simply join the crowds and make his way out. They would never be able to trace the bomb to him. There wouldn't be any evidence at all. People might die, people he knew. Could he really do this? The switch was right there in front of him. So small, all he had to do was flick it and the countdown would begin. Ravi Chandra took a deep breath. He reached out with a single finger. He pressed the switch. It was the last thing he did in his life. The men from the street corner had lied to him. There was no 10-minute delay when he activated the bomb. It went off immediately, almost vaporizing him. Ravi was dead so quickly that he never even knew that he had been betrayed, and that his wife was now a widow, and that his children would never meet Mickey Mouse. Nor did he see the effect of what he had done. Exactly as planned, the bomb had torn a hole in the side of the coolant pump, smashing the rotors. There was a hideous metallic grinding as the entire thing tore itself apart. One of the other plant operators, the same man who had been chatting about Cricket just a few minutes ago, was killed instantly, thrown off his feet and into the reactor pit. The other engineers in the chamber froze, their eyes filled with horror as they saw what was happening. Scattering down for cover, they were too late. There was another explosion and suddenly the air was filled with shrapnel, spinning fragments of metal and machinery that had been turned into vicious missiles. The 2 closest men were cut to pieces. The others turned to run for the airlock. None of them made it. Sirens were already sounding, lights flashing as the machinery disintegrated. Everything in the chamber turned into a black and red hell. A cable whipped down, trailing sparks. There were 3 more explosions, pipes wrenching themselves free, fireballs spinning outwards, and then a roar as burning steam came rushing in. Out like an express train. The worst had happened. Jagged knives of broken metal had smashed open the pipes, and although the reactor was already closing down, there were several tons of radioactive steam with nowhere to go. One man was caught in the full blast and disappeared with a single hideous scream. The steam thundered out, filling the entire chamber. Normally the walls and the dome would have contained it, but Ravi Chandra, in almost the last act of his life, had opened the emergency airlock. Like some alien stampede, the steam found it and burst through, out into the open air. It all over the Jawada power station. Systems were being shut down, corridors emptied, emergency safety measures put into place, but it was already too late. The people of Chennai saw a huge plume of white smoke rise up into the air. They heard the alarms. Workers at Jawada were calling their relatives into the city, warning them to get out. The panic began at once. More than a million men, women, and children dropped what they were doing and tried to find a way through the traffic. Now they come to a complete standstill. Fights broke up. There were collisions and smash-ups at a dozen different junctions and traffic lights, but it had all happened too quickly, and not a single person made it out of the city before the radioactive cloud blown by a northerly wind fell onto them. The story appeared that night on television news all around the world. It was estimated that at least 100 people had died in the hour following the explosion. There had been casualties within the Jawad power station itself, but curiously, far more were killed in the mad crash to get out of Chennai. By the following morning, the newspaper headlines were calling it nuclear nightmare, in capital letters, of course. The Indian authorities were adamant that the steam cloud would have contained only low-level radiation, and there were just as many experts who disagreed. 24 hours later, an appeal was made to help the people of Chennai. Further casualties were being reported. Homes and shops had been looted. There were still riots in the streets, and the army had been called in to restore order. Why is the entire army? I can't believe it. They chose the army. So the army had been sent in to restore order. Restore order. The hospitals were full of desperate people. One British charity, it's called itself First Aid, came forward with a comprehensive plan to distribute food, blankets, and most important of all, potassium iodate tablets for every one of the 8 million people of Chennai to counter possible radiation sickness. As always, the British people were unfailing in their generosity. By the end of the week, they had raised £1.25 million. Of course, if the disaster had been more greater, they would have raised much, much more. Chapter 2. Reflections in a Mirror. Alex Ryder took one last glance in the mirror, then stopped and looked a second time. It was strange, but he wondered if he recognized the boy who was looking back. There were the thin lips, the slightly chiseled nose and chin, the fair hair hanging in 2 strands over the dark eyebrows. He raised a hand, and obediently his reflection did the same. There was something different about this other Alex Ryder. It wasn't quite him. Of course, the clothes he was wearing didn't help. In a few minutes, he would be leaving for a New Year's Eve party, being held at a castle on the banks of Loch Arkaig in the Highlands of Scotland. And the invitation had been clear: dress, black tie. Reluctantly, I had gone out and rented the entire outfit: dinner jacket, black trousers, and a white shirt with a stick-up collar that was too tight and dug into his neck. The one thing he had refused to put on was the pair of polished leather shoes that the shop assistant had insisted would make the outfit complete. Black trainers would have to do. What did it make him look like? He wanted to see straighten the bow tie for the 10th time. A young James Bond. He hated the comparison, but he couldn't avoid. It wasn't just the clothes. As Alex continued his examination, he had to admit that so much had happened in the last year. He'd almost lost track of who and what he was. Standing in front of the mirror, it was as if he had just stepped out of the merry-go-round that his life had become. He might be still, but the world around him was spinning. Just 2 months ago, he'd been in Australia, not on holiday, not visiting relatives, but incredibly working for the Australian Secret Intelligence Service. Disguised as an Afghan refugee, he had been sent to infiltrate the people smuggling gang known as the Snakehead. But his mission had taken him much further than that. Setting him against Major Winston Yu and potential devastation of a huge bomb buried deep inside a fault line in the Earth's crust. It had also brought him face to face with his godfather, the man he had known only as Ash. Thinking about him now, Alex saw something spark in his eyes. Was it anger? Grief? Alex had never known his parents, and he thought Ash would somehow be able to explain where he had come from, to make sense of his past. But his godfather had done nothing of the sort of their meeting, had led instead to betrayal and death. And that was really it. It really is it, wasn't it? That was what the boy in the mirror was trying to tell him. He was still only 14 years old, but this last year, a year whose end they were about to celebrate, had almost destroyed him. If he closed his eyes, he could still feel Major Yu's walking stick smashing into the side of his head, the crushing weight of the water under the Bora Falls, the punishment he had taken in the Thai boxing ring in Bangkok. And those were just the most recent in a string of injuries. How many times had he got punched, kicked, beaten, knocked out, and shot? His wounds might have healed, but he would still be reminded of them every time he undressed. The scar left by the .22 bullet fired into his chest by a sniper on a rooftop in Liverpool Street would always be with him. And memory of pain, they say, that never leaves you either. Had it changed him? Of course it had. Nobody could survive all this and say the same. And yet, Alex, stop admiring yourself in the mirror and get downstairs. It was Sabina. Alex turned and saw her standing in the doorway, wearing a silver dress with lots of glitter around the neckline. Her dark hair, she had grown it for long, was tied back, unusually for her. She was wearing makeup, pale blue eyeshadow, and glossy pink lipstick. Dad's waiting. We're about to leave. I'll be 1 minute. Alex twisted the bow tie again, wondering what he had to do to stop the damn thing going crooked. He looked ridiculous. Nobody under the age of 50 should have to dress like this. But at least he'd be able to resist Serena's suggestion that he should go to the party dressed in a kilt. She'd been teasing him about it since Christmas. Despite everything, the last 6 weeks, he had been fantastic for Alex Ryder. First of all, Sabina and her parents had unexpectedly arrived in England. Edward Pleasure was a journalist. He had almost been killed once investigating a pop star called Damian Gray. Alex had blamed himself for that, and when at the end of it, Sabina had left for America. He had been certain he would never see her again, but now she was back in his life, and although she was a year older than he was, the two had never been closer. It helped perhaps that she was one of the few people who knew about the involvement with MI6. But better still, the Pleasures had invited Alex to join them for New Year at a house they had rented in the West Highlands of Scotland. Hawk's Lodge was a Victorian pile that had been named after an obscure poet rather than the bird. It stood 3 stories high on the edge of woodland, with Ben Nevis in the background. It was the sort of house that needed roaring log fires, hot chocolate, old-fashioned board games, and too much to eat. Liz Pleasure, Sabina's mother, had supplied all this and more from the moment they'd arrived. In the past few days, the 4 of them had gone hill walking and fishing. They had visited ruined castles and isolated villages, and strolled along the famous white sands of Morar. Sabina had hoped it might snow. There was good skiing over at Cairngorm, and she had brought her gear with her. But although it was freezing outside, so far the weather had only managed a few flurries. There was no television in the house, and Edward had banned Sabina from bringing her Nintendo. So they had spent the evenings playing Scrabble or Perudo, the Peruvian game of liar dice, which Alex nearly always won. If there was one thing he'd learnt in his life, it was how to lie. Meanwhile, Jack Starbright, Alex's housekeeper, and in many ways his closest friend, was in Washington. She had been invited up to Scotland too, but she had decided to go home for New Year to see her parents. As he followed her out of the house, it had crossed Alex's mind that one day she would go back to America for good. Her parents and the rest of her family were there. He wondered what would happen to him when she did. She had looked after him since his uncle had died, and as far as he knew, there was nobody to take her place. As if reading his thoughts, she had given him a hug while the taxi driver loaded her cases. "Don't worry, Alex, I'll see you in a week. Just try and have a good time in Scotland. See if you can make it past New Year without getting into trouble. Don't forget, school starts on the 6th. There's no reason to be cheerful. Alex had managed to complete almost half a term at Brooklyn without getting kidnapped, shot at, or recruited by one of the world's security agencies. He had begun to feel like an ordinary schoolboy, again being told off for talking in class, sweating over his homework, listening out for the bell that meant the end of the day. He took one last look in the mirror. Jack was right. Forget James Bond. He'd had enough of all that. He was leaving it behind. He went down 2 flights of stairs to a wood-panelled hall with its rather gloomy paintings of Scottish wildlife. Edward Pleasure was waiting with Sabina. It seemed to Alex that the journalists had got quite a lot older since they had last met. There were definitely more lines in his face. He now wore glasses all the time, and he had lost a lot of weight. He also limped, supporting himself with a heavy walking stick, metal-tipped and with a brass handle shaped like a duck's head. His wife had bought it for him in an antique shop in London. She had joked if any of the people he wrote about ever tried to attack him again, at least he'd have something he could use to defend himself. That was what Alex liked most about his family. They stuck together, and no matter what happened, they always seemed to be cheerful. He found it easy spending time with them, slipping into their routine. And Alex liked to imagine that, in many ways, his parents would have been just like Edward and Liz. The journalist had also put on black tie for the evening, but Alex saw at once that there was a problem. "What is it?" he asked. "Mum's not coming," Sabina replied. She was looking frustrated. Alex knew she had spent hours getting ready for the party. Now at the last minute something gone wrong. "She said she's not feeling up to it," Edward explained. "It's nothing serious, just a touch of flu." I think we should all stay," said Sabina. "That's nonsense, Sabina. The 3 of you go and enjoy yourselves." Liz Pleasure had appeared at one of the doorways. She was a pleasant, easygoing woman with a long, straggly hair. She didn't care how she looked, and she liked to run a house without rules. Now she was wearing a baggy jersey, and jeans holding a box of tissues. I don't much like parties anyway. I'm certainly not going out in this weather. But you don't want to be here for New Year on your own. I'm going out for a hot bath with some of that expensive oil your dad bought me for Christmas. Then I'm going to bed. I'll be asleep long before midnight. She went over to Sabina and put her arm around her. Honestly, Sab, it doesn't bother me. You can celebrate New Year tomorrow. You can tell me what I've missed. But Mum, we won't enjoy it without you. Of course you will. You love parties and you look terrific. Both of you. This pleasure had made up her mind. You have to go. Your dad's got the tickets and they're worth a fortune. She beamed at Alex. You look after her, Alex. And remember, this is a party. A party in a real Scottish castle. Hogmanay. And all the rest of it, I'm sure you're going to have a fantastic time. There was no point in any further argument. And 20 minutes later, Alex found himself being driven along the twisting road that led north to Loch Arcade. Not arcade. Arcade. The weather had got worse. The snow that Sabina had been hoping for was falling more heavily. Was falling more heavily, swirling in front of the headlights as they cut through the night. Edward Pleasure was driving a Nissan X-Trail which he had rented at Inverness Airport. Alex was glad he had chosen a 4x4. The snow was already settling. Any thicker, and they would need the extra traction. Sabina was stretched out in the back, untangling her iPod. Alex was in the front. It was the first time he'd been alone with Edward Pleasure since the south of France, and he had felt a little uncomfortable. The journalist must have known about his involvement with MI6. Sabina would have told him everything that had happened, but the two of them had never discussed it, as if it was somehow impolite. It's good to have you with us, Alex, Edward muttered. He was deliberately keeping his voice down so that Sabina plugged into Coldplay wouldn't hear. I know Seb was really glad you could tag along. I've had a great time, Alex said. He thought about for a moment. I'm sorry about tonight, though. Edward smiled. We don't have to stay too long if you don't want to. What Liz said was right. Nobody celebrates New Year like the Scottish. And Kilmore Castle is quite a place. Dates back to the 13th century. It was torn down in the first Jacobite rising and stayed more or less in the ruins until it was bought by Desmond McCain. Isn't he the man you're writing about? That's right, he's the main reason we're going to the Reverend Desmond McCain. Edward reached down and flickered a switch, blowing hot air over the windscreen. The wipers were doing their best, but snow was still sticking to the glass surface. It was warm and cozy inside the car. It marked contrast with the world outside. He's an interesting man, Alex. Do you know anything about him? Not really. Thought you might have read about him in the papers. He was brought up in an orphanage in East London. No parents, no family, nothing. He'd been abandoned in a supermarket trolley wrapped in a plastic bag. McCain oven chips. That's how he got his name. He was fostered by a couple in Hackney, and from that moment things started going better for him. He did well at school, at least in sport. By the time he was 18, he had become a famous boxer. He won the WBO middleweight title twice, and everyone thought he'd made it a hat-trick. Except he got knocked out in the first round by Buddy Sangster in Madison Square Garden in 1983. Didn't something happen to Sangster? Alex asked. He heard the name somewhere before. That's right. He died a year later. He fell under a train in the New York subway. They showed his funeral on TV. One of his fans even sent him 100 black tulips. I remember hearing that. Edward shook his head. Anyway, Desmond McCain wasn't boxing anymore. His jaw had been smashed up pretty badly. He went to some plastic surgery in Las Vegas, but it was butt shop and it never healed properly. To this day he can only eat soft food. He can't chew, but it wasn't the end of him. He went into business, property development, and he was very good at it. There was a dozen families in Rotherhithe down on the River Thames, and somehow he persuaded them to sell cheaply to him, and then he knocked down their houses and put up a bunch of skyscrapers and made a fortune. That was about the time that he became interested in politics. He donated thousands of pounds to the Conservative Party, and suddenly he announced he wanted to be an MP. Of course, they welcomed him with open arms. He was rich, he was successful, and he was black. That was the part of it too. And the next thing you know, he managed to get himself elected in a corner of London, which hadn't voted Conservative since the 19th century, and even then it was only by mistake. People liked him. It was the typical rags to reach a story. You could say plastic bags to rich. You could say plastic bags back to riches. In his case, he got a big majority, and a year later, he was a minister in the Department for Sport. There was even talk that he could one day become our first black PM. So what went wrong? Edward sighed. Everything. It turned out that his business hadn't been doing as well as people thought. One or two of his developments had fallen behind schedule, and he had huge financial problems. The bank was closing in, and it looked as if he might go bankrupt. And of course, you're not allowed to be a member of Parliament if that happens. God knows what he was thinking. But he decided to set fire to one of his properties and claim on the insurance that was his way out of the mess. Well, the property in question was a 24-storey office block overlooking St. Paul's. One night, it was simply burnt to the ground. The next day, McCain put in a claim for £50 million. Problem solved. They came to a sharp bend in the road, and Edward Pleasure slowed down. By now, the whole road was snow-covered, with dark pine trees looming up on both sides. At least that was what he thought. He went on. Unfortunately, the insurance company smelled a rat. They started asking questions, like, for example, why had the alarms have been switched off? Why had the security staff been allowed to leave early? There was a lot of gossip in the press. And then suddenly a witness appeared. It turned out there'd been a homeless person sleeping in the underground park. He'd been there when McCain drove in with 6 gallons of petrol and a cigarette lighter. He was lucky to get away alive. Anyway, McCain was arrested. There was a fairly sensational trial, and he was sent to prison for 9 years. I said, listen to all this in silence. You called him the Reverend McCain, he said. That's a strange thing. In a way, McCain's whole life had been bizarre. But while he was in jail, he converted to Christianity. He did a correspondence course and became a priest in some church no one has ever heard of. And when he got out, that was 5 years ago, he didn't go back into business or politics. He said he'd spent his whole life being selfish, and he wanted to put all that behind him. Instead, he set up a charity, First Aid. That's what it's called. It provides a rapid response to emergencies all over the world. How much further? Sabina's voice came from the back seat. She was still plugged into her iPod. Edward Pleasure held up a hand and opened it twice, signaling 10 minutes. You interviewed him, Alex said. Yes, I've done a big piece for GQ. They'll be publishing it next month. And you'll meet him tonight, Alex. You can see for yourself. He has an enormous amount of energy and he's channeled into helping people less fortunate himself. He's managed to helping people less than fortunate himself. Less than fortunate himself. He's raised millions for famine relief in Africa, bushfires in Australia, floods in Malaysia, even the accident in South India, Jawada. Alex nodded. He'd read about it when he'd working as a ball boy at Wimbledon. It had made the front pages. The nuclear reactor, he said. Edward nodded. For a time it looked as if the whole city of Chile could be affected. Fortunately, it wasn't as bad as that, but a lot of people were killed in the panic. First aid were up and running the very next day, getting anti-radiation stuff to the women and kids, helping with supplies, that sort of thing. Nobody was quite sure how they got off the mark so quickly, but that's how they work. Instant response. Their aim to be the first charity in. And you really think this man, McCain, is genuine? Do I think he's another Damien Gray? Edward smiled briefly. It has been his article exposing Gray as a maniac that had almost got him killed. Well, I did have my doubts when I first met him. I mean, if he wasn't a crook, he was a Tory politician, which didn't exactly recommend him. But you don't need to worry, Alex. I did a lot of research into his charity. I interviewed him. I met a few people who knew him. I spoke to the police and I opened their old files. The truth is, I couldn't find anything bad to write about him. He really does seem to be a rich man who made a bad mistake and who's trying to make up for it. How come he owns a castle? If he went bankrupt, that's a good question. After he went to prison, he lost all his money, everything. But he had powerful friends, both in the city and in the Tory party. They did what they could to help him out. Thanks to them, he managed to hang on to Kilmore Castle. He also had a London flat, and he's part owner of a business somewhere in Kenney. A car suddenly appeared in the road beside them overtaking. Edward slowed down to let it pass. He watched as it swallowed up by the little swelling snow. I'd be interested to hear what you think of McCain, he muttered. Did he invite you? Yes, when I met him, he mentioned I was planning to be in Scotland for New Year, and he gave me 4 tickets. That is just as well. They actually cost £300 each. I let out a low whistle. Well, it's all for charity. All the profits will go to first aid. There'll be a lot of rich people there tonight. They'll raise tens of thousands. There was another brief silence. The road had begun to climb steeply uphill, and Edward changed down a gear. We never really talked about Damien Gray, Edward said, and twisted in his seat. There's nothing to say. My book about him sold 1 million copies, but I never mentioned you or your part in what happened. I preferred it that way. You saved Sabina's life. She saved mine. Can I give you some advice, Alex? Edward's pleasure had to keep his eyes on the road, but just for a moment he turned them on Alex. Stay away from all that MI6, intelligence, all the rest of it. I've a good idea what's been going on all over the past year. Sabina's told me some things of it, but I have contacts in the CIA, and I hear things. You don't want to know what you've been through, but believe me, you're better off out of it. Don't worry, I don't think MI6 are interested in me anymore. They didn't even send me a Christmas card. That part of my life is over, and I'm glad. The road was even steeper now. The trees had fallen away on one side to reveal an expanse of black water. Loch Arcade, trudging up below. It was still snowing, but the flakes didn't seem to be making any contact with the half-frozen surfaces. If it were if it were still snowing, with the flakes seemed as if the two were somehow cancelling each other out. The lot was said to have its own monster, a giant water horse. Looking at eyes would well believe it. Look Arcade had been left by the glaciers, 12 miles long and in a place 100 meters deep. Who could say what secrets it had managed to keep to itself for the past million years? There was Kilmore Castle looming up above him, almost invisible around the sweeping snow lodge, completely dominating the surrounding landscape. A massive pile of grey stone with towering towers and battlements. Narrow slit-like windows, soaring archways, and solid, unwelcoming doors. There was nothing about the place that had been built for comfort. It insisted only to rule and to keep those inside it in power. It was hard to imagine how it had ever fallen, or for that matter, how it had been built. Even the Nissan X-Trail, with its 2.2-litre four-cylinder turbo diesel engine, seemed to be struggling as it negotiated the tight hairpin bends. That was the only way up. Had soldiers once come here on horseback, how could they possibly have penetrated those massive walls? They were in a queue of traffic now, with other partygoers just visible behind the frosty windows of their cars. The last bend brought them to a wide open space which had been converted into a car park with attendants in day-glow jackets, frantically signalling where to go. 2 fiery torches had been placed on either side of the main entrance, the flames fighting the snow. Men and women in heavy coats, their faces lost behind scarves, were hurrying across the gravel and bundling themselves. Scrolling across the gravel and bundling themselves in. There was nothing like almost nightmarish about the scene. It didn't look like a party. These people could have been refugees running from their lives from some freak act of nature. Off Whitepad, Edward Pleasure parked the car and Sabina took off her iPod. "We don't have to stay until midnight," her father told her. "If you want to leave earlier, just let me know." "Wish Mum had come," Sabina muttered. "Me too, but you know she wouldn't want us to worry about her. Let's just have fun." They got out of the car, and after that warmth of the interior, Alex was immediately hit by the deep chill of the night. The snow dancing in front of the eyes, the wind rushing through his hair. He had no coat and broke into a run, hugging himself, using his shoulders to battle through the elements. It was as if the very worst of winter had somehow been concentrated on the rocky platform. High above the lodge, the flames of the beacons writhed and twisted. Somebody shouted something, but the words were snatched away, and then they reached the archway and passed through into an inner courtyard where at least the wind couldn't penetrate. Alex found himself in an irregularly shaped space with high walls, cannons, and a huge bonfire, and about a dozen guests were crowded round it, feeling the warmth and laughing as they brushed the snow off their sleeves. A second archway stood ahead of him. This one was with carved eagles and an inscription of Gaelic, the letters glowing red and shimmering in the light of the fire. Chadiane no Sgrios Nemihid Din Gus Ambithuria Fire Colade. "What's that?" Sabina asked. Edward shrugged, but next to him one of the other guests had overheard. "It's the motto of Kilmore clan," he explained. This was where their ancestral home. They were here for 300 years. Do you know what it means? Yes, you cannot defeat your enemies until you know who they are. The guests pushed forward and disappeared into the castle. Alex stared at the inscription. He wondered if he, in some way, it wasn't speaking to him. Then he dismissed the thought. The new year was about to begin, and with a set of new rules, there was no more enemies. And that was what he had decided. Come on, Alex. Sabina grabbed his arm, and together they went in. Goodbye, everyone. And thank you for me listening, for you listening to me reading you the first time I'm ever reading you Crocodile Tears, Book 8 of Alex Rider. So goodbye everyone, and thank you for listening to this. But goodbye everyone, and thank you for listening to this.